made in the image of God? Most of you will probably find today's video really boring. It's going to be a little bit technical, a little bit academic. My usual Christian opponents out there will no doubt hate me again while praying lovingly for my salvation. Most of you probably just won't find it at all interesting because you have no particular interest in the Bible. And why should you? I'm often asked why I would bother spending time looking at the Bible and issues of the kind that I often raise here, as if the only possible reason for reading the Bible was faith and devotion. On the contrary, I do so out of academic and historical interest. I would do the same with, say, Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad if I thought I had the competence to do so. But I don't have the background and competence I would need to tackle those texts confidently. With the Bible, I feel somewhat more confident. Examining the biblical text critically is fun for me. Sad, I know. Oh, please understand that critically here doesn't imply that I'm criticizing or attacking the Bible. I have no interest at all in doing that. Critically here is used in the sense of literary criticism, the study, evaluation, and interpretation of literature. It's exactly the same approach that I would take in trying to understand Homer or Shakespeare. If I were trying to determine the true authorship of a particular play that is commonly attributed to Shakespeare, but about which there is perhaps some doubt regarding its authorship, this would not be understood as a criticism of Shakespeare. Similarly, if I were to try to determine whether a particular passage of the Odyssey was inserted by a later editor, this would not be a criticism of Homer. Similarly, if I try to understand what a particular biblical passage means in its original context without later theological accretions, this is not to be understood in any way as a criticism of the Bible or of its authors. It's simply an attempt to better understand the text as a piece of literature. And I find that really interesting and really fun to do. Today I want to look at the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, as expressed in the book of Genesis. Why? Because these stories in Genesis have played a very important role in the development of Western culture, especially in the development of the Christian narrative, and in particular the creation narratives of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. It's interesting to see what the image of God might have meant in those earlier stories, how it fits into the broader biblical narrative, independent of its interpretation in later Christian thinking. You don't have to believe any of this to find it interesting. I have a general interest in the history of ideas. It's always good to take a closer look at some of these ideas that are taken for granted, to see perhaps whether there's more or less to them than is usually assumed. I also like to illustrate how I think the biblical text is best approached, whether you do so as a believer or just out of academic interest. So I think this kind of video is useful from that point of view. But if you're not at all interested in any of this, it's fine by me if you just move along. You probably already have. We first encounter this idea of the image of God in the first chapter of Genesis. In verse 26 we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" Okay, so there are 2 words here that we should look at more closely: image and likeness. These Hebrew words are respectively tselem and demut. The word tselem typically refers to a physical or visual representation. It's often associated with the concept of an idol or a statue that represents a deity or a person. This would seem to imply that human beings actually physically resemble God in some fashion. Although the idea may not be popular today, this may reflect the idea that God actually had a physical anthropomorphic form, and humans are made to look like that. Seth Adam and Eve's son, is described as the Tselem of Adam, a chip off the old block if you like. In several passages the word is used to refer to idols, which are clearly intended to be visual representations of a deity. It's worth noting that this idea of human beings as the image of God is found nowhere else in the Old Testament outside the Genesis narrative, although some would point to passages like Psalm 8 verses 3 to 6, which express wonder that God would care for humans and give them dominion over the earth. Some would see this as reflecting the idea expressed in Genesis that human beings are made in the image of God, made to have dominion over the animals. Now that may be a reasonable interpretation of the later part of Genesis 1:26, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, etc. If this is seen as an expansion of or explanation for this idea of image. But before considering this, let's look at the second word used here, demut, translated as likeness. Demut signifies resemblance or similarity, but not necessarily an exact replica. So not a copy or even necessarily a representation, such as an idol might be considered to be, but something resembling an original. Human beings are made to resemble God. Now, this may be an example of poetic parallelism, as is often found in Hebrew poetry, where the same idea is expressed in two different ways. And the two words are, in fact, used in very similar ways elsewhere. For example, demut is also used to express the idea of the likeness between Adam and his son, and it is also used to refer to idols. My inclination then is not to emphasize any distinction between these words, as some interpreters have done, but to see them as saying the same thing in parallel. And the remainder of this verse may then be interpreted as expanding on this, explaining what the terms image and likeness actually mean when used to describe human beings, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and so on. It may be then, in this sense, that human beings are like God or made in his image, in the sense that they have dominion over creation, almost as a kind of viceroy. This is a functional interpretation of the image of God, rather than, say, a substantive understanding, according to which human beings share certain characteristics with God, such as their psychological or spiritual makeup. The one reservation I have about this functional interpretation of image is that Tselem and demut are not the usual terms used to describe a viceroy or a political representative. This is usually the Hebrew word sar, but at the moment I think that's the best fit. Now let's look at the narrative in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. For those of you who are not familiar with this, I should mention that the general consensus of biblical scholars is that there are in fact two different versions of the creation story here. The P, or priestly account, which is what we find in chapter 1, and which was probably composed around the end of the 6th or the beginning of the 5th century BCE. And the second account in chapters 2 and 3, which is probably an older account, attributed to an author identified as J, or the Yahwist. These stories have subsequently been placed side by side by a later editor without any attempt to smooth out the differences, until eventually we've come to read them as a single narrative. In fact, these P and J strands extend further into the Genesis narrative. If you don't accept this view, well, that's too bad. You won't really be able to understand what's actually going on here in the Bible, and you really won't be able to understand what I have to say next, because I certainly assume this model in what follows. Interestingly, in this second account of creation, God is depicted in a much more anthropomorphic fashion than in chapter 1. He strolls in the garden in the cool of the evening, and his footsteps can be heard. But there's nothing in this version of the creation of man about his being made in the image of God. It's not until chapter 3 verse 22, in fact, that any concept of likeness occurs. So it's not, in fact, until after Adam's act of disobedience. In chapter 3 verse 22 we read, "And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. he must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Here in the phrase, like one of us, the preposition ke is used. This is often used to form similes, as for example in Psalm 1 verse 3, he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Or in Isaiah 53:6, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Or in metaphors such as we find in Jeremiah 18:6, like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel. The meaning here seems to be that Adam now resembles one of us, one of the council of divine beings perhaps, in the sense apparently that he now knows good and evil. He has become a moral being. Most notably though, he's not like God in the sense of being immortal, because he's prevented from eating from the tree of life by the expulsion from the garden. This would presumably have made him even more like one of us. I'm not sure why Adam hasn't already eaten from the tree of life, but maybe that's a discussion for another time. So the interesting point here is that in this second story, Adam is not made in the image or likeness of God. He only becomes like God after he has eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and becomes a moral being. So becoming like God is a consequence of what Christian theology came to call the fall, according to this particular creation narrative anyway. Subsequent Christian theology has made the corruption of the image of God, imago Dei, in human beings one of its central tenets. There's debate about the extent of that corruption. This, of course, is referring to the idea expressed in Genesis 1, not Genesis 3. It's worth noting that the P strand of Genesis continues to refer to man as having been made in the image of God after the fall, as for example in Genesis chapter 9 verse 6. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. But of course the priestly author, P, knows absolutely nothing about the fall or the expulsion from the garden. In the New Testament, James chapter 3 verse 9 refers to the image of God seemingly in the sense of the priestly stream of Genesis. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. There's a lot of talk in the New Testament about human beings conforming to the image of Jesus rather than to God. But Jesus himself is understood as the perfect image of God. But this doesn't necessarily refer to the restoration of an old, lost image, but rather to something new, as in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So, the priestly narrative of Genesis says that humanity, both male and female, is created in the image and likeness of God, which seems to be referring to the dominion that human beings have over creation, which is a reflection of God's own power and dominion. The same writer knows nothing about this having been lost or corrupted. The New Testament still sometimes refers to this image in the P sense, but at other times it emphasizes Jesus as the true image of God and human beings becoming conformed to his image as something new rather than as a restoration. So I think there are probably several streams of thought here. Now, in the course of this video, you may have encountered several ideas that are new to you. The first may be that there are in fact two creation stories in the early chapters of Genesis. I've referred to this in previous videos, but you may not have seen them. The second new idea may be that these two versions of the creation story are not entirely consistent with each other. In the context of this video, J says nothing about Adam having been created in the image of God. The likeness is only mentioned after Adam and Eve's disobedience and is a consequence of this. In P, this likeness has to do with human beings' dominion over creation. In J, it has to do with human beings knowing good and evil, which is not at all regarded by J as a positive or desirable thing. The third idea you may not have encountered before is that the author of P knows nothing at all about the fall or about the expulsion from the garden. There's no indication in this particular narrative that the image of God has been corrupted in any way. The New Testament sometimes continues to refer to human beings as made in the image of God. At other times it seems to refer to this as a new thing rather than as something which is being restored. And it's more about being made into the image or likeness of Christ than God himself, although Christ is seen as the perfect image of God. So human beings are the image of an image. For me, though, the most interesting part of all of this is the idea maintained by the J author of Genesis, the Yahwist, that the likeness between God and man is actually a consequence of the fall, and not something that God approves of in the slightest. The God of J continues to be concerned about this uppityness of human beings, as for instance in the story of the Tower of Babel, when human beings try to make a name for themselves. These two strands of the Genesis narrative have very different understandings of humanity, and in particular of human beings' relationship with God, and I find this fascinating.